The tyranny of this dictatorship isn't primarily the fault of big business, nor the demagogues who do their dirty work. It's the fault of Dormus Jessup. Of all the conscientious, respectable, lazy-minded Dormus Jessups who had let the demagogues wriggle in without fierce enough protest. A few months ago, I thought the slaughter of the Civil War and the agitation of the violent abolitionists who helped bring it on were evil. They had to be violent, because easygoing citizens like me couldn't be stirred up otherwise. If our grandfathers had had the alertness and courage to see the evils of slavery and of a government conducted by gentlemen for gentlemen only, there wouldn't have been any need of agitators and war and blood. It's my sort, the responsible citizens, who felt ourselves superior because we've been well-to-do and what we thought was educated, who brought on the Civil War, the French Revolution, and now the fascist dictatorship. It's I who murdered Rabbi de Verez. It's I who persecuted the Jews and the blacks. I can claim no Aris Dilly, no Shad Ledoux, no Buzz Windrup, but only my own timid soul and drowsy mind. Forgive me, O Lord. Is it too late? Unquote. This is a monologue of the main character speaking to himself, Dormus Jessup, in It Can't Happen Here, Chapter 19. Hello and welcome back to the library. And before we get lost amongst the stacks, I want to reintroduce my guest today, the People's Farmer, the Burlington Goncho, the avant-garde agronomist, Nour Noah el-Naboulsi. Welcome back, Nour. How are you doing?
Great. Thank you. Yeah, I could get that intro every day and you know, get a little pep in my step to get going. Thank you.
No problem. We just left off with the history of the context and such about what happened before It Can't Happen Here was written, and today we're going to basically just go into the details of how Sinclair Lewis wrote and why he wrote about it, but mostly about the book itself. But do you have any thoughts before we move on and start talking about it?
No, I love that monologue. I noted that whole thing in my notes here. It's so true and so honest and so real, and I think that any good conscious person right now in our country feels that little pit in their stomach that we could and should be doing more, but we're just trained into complacency. But so I think about that monologue a lot.
Yeah, and I wrote later about how I believe that Sinclair Lewis really put himself into the main character, Dormus Jessup, even though he's 30 years his younger, 20 years his younger when he wrote. But we'll get into that. So, like I said, this podcast episode is about the book itself, with the structure, character, setting, plot, content, and our thoughts as well. As I mentioned in the previous episode, I try to avoid spoilers as much as possible, but today, we're not going to just go for it. I want to avoid it, honestly, just to encourage readers to actually read it, but we're breaking the rule because many people already know what's going to happen in this book, just not the details. So if you are reading it and don't want to listen to this and for us to ruin it, maybe wait until after you've completed reading your homework and listen to the podcast then, and agree or disagree all you want. That'd be great. We're always encouraging that. But before we spoil this book for some, let's chat the structure. This is very much in the writing style and structure typical to Sinclair Lewis. He was known for his lengthy descriptions, many direct references to topical and contemporary issues at the time that admittedly goes over many people's heads today or feel a bit overwhelmed. So if you are reading it and feel overwhelmed, just power through them as much as possible and you'll get to a point where you're going to enjoy it again. There are satirical portrayals of ideas and people and tongue-in-cheek humorous and sarcastic remarks. Here's an example of some of the humor he does in just a couple of sentences. Quote, being a person who read little and therefore took what he did seriously, Buck was distressed by the normally studious Lorinda's vacation of liking for novels about distressed princesses, and when she airily insisted that they were better guides to conduct than Anthony Trollope or Thomas Hardy, Buck roared at her, and in the feebleness of bated strength, nervously filled pipes and knocked out against the stone mantle. Unquote. Buck and Lorinda are fake characters of the book, but Anthony Trollope and Thomas Hardy were actual British authors who wrote about 50 or 75 years before It Can't Happen Here was published. It's kind of like how we're talking about Sinclair Lewis, though. This was published 90 years before. Sinclair Lewis's books are also, he always just wants to satirize and delves deeper into the satire than any other author I ever read. He literally leaves no stone unturned when he's poking fun at a topic. This could mean that there are many chapters or sections of books where the plot doesn't really progress because he's just on one of his soapboxes.
He is sassy and sarcastic. I was just snickering to myself the whole time. He's so sassy.
Yeah. I mean, that's the reason why he wasn't very popular to some people, because he just called them out. A lot of
his readers, because he just calls out the dumb, complacent, average person who probably that's a big portion of his readership too, but he didn't care.
Yeah, no, I mean, Babel, one of his biggest books is exactly that. And Main Street. Yeah, it's pretty crazy. It can't happen here. There's about 150 to 200 pages before you really start getting into the plot. Of course, things progress, like the characters' descriptions and how they act after the election of a fascist, as well as the statuses change basically overnight and updates throughout America. In American life beyond Vermont, which this is where the novel takes place, spoiler, but the real resistance and ramifications caused by the election take a while to progress, and Sinclair Lewis does take his time with the exposition, the meat and potatoes of the world building, if you will, if this was a sci-fi fantasy novel of 1930s fictionalized America. He does a great job describing Winthrop's political platform and how he won the Democratic Party and then got elected, and how Dormus Jessup reacts for it, for example. Anything else you want to add about that?
I honestly loved, my favorite part of the book was the build-up. Was the scene setting, the Vermont setting, the build-up of how the fascism just creeps into the pores and everyone wants to say it can't happen here, and then suddenly it's here, which was good too. Once again, spoilers, but again, you can assume it's a classic. Once the fascism happens, it was still very good, but it was kind of, I really did like that slow, creepy build-up, almost like a horror movie character creeping up. Yeah.
That's great. Yeah, that was my favorite part too. Pivoting to the setting, as I mentioned, the vast majority of the novel takes place in Vermont. I thought there would be a deeper reason for placing the setting in northern Vermont specifically, as Vermont in this era was a huge Republican stronghold. In fact, when Vermont was redistricted back to have its own representative in 1933, only one Democrat was elected between the years of 33 and 91, and he only sat for one term. Do you want to guess the person who, in 1991, finally unseated the GOP to flip Vermont to more left-leaning?
Blue-eyed Bill Clinton?
No. This is a representative of the state.
No, I don't know.
You know him very well. You definitely know this dude.
Is it Bernie?
It's Bernie Sanders in 91. Yeah, he held it for a while, and since then there's only been two other representatives that held the House.
Wow.
Yeah.
Cool.
Becca Balint and Peter Welch. That's it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. I like them all, I gotta say.
It's crazy to think that for 60 years, basically, this state is totally different like that. This is important because Buzz Winthrop, the fascist politician who becomes president, doesn't run under the Republicans. In fact, he runs as a Democrat to try to unseat FDR in the Democratic primary. The GOP who runs against Buzz ends up being one of the political leaders in the New Underground, or the movement that tries to dismantle the fascist government towards the end of the book. This isn't because Sinclair Lewis actually believed the GOP was somehow less susceptible to strongman dictatorship, or even that it was less conservative. That's absolutely not it at all. Rather, it's because the left wing were the ones showing that they were probably more comfortable at the time into not following due process. And it was, as we described in the first episode about Huey Long, who Buzz Winthrop is partially based off of. Vermont's elections in the 30s also showed that they were not in tune with the rest of the country, continuing to elect politicians friendly with bankers and interests that helped cause the Great Depression, right? So we kept, everybody was a GOP around here when there were no other part of the country really was. Rather, the novel takes place in Vermont because Sinclair Lewis purchased twin farms in Barnard, Vermont, as a wedding gift to his second wife, Dorothy Thompson, in 1928, and this is where he would vacation sometimes in the summer. It's basically just that easy. He happened to be in his home in Barnard, where he rewrote the book to take place in the state as the setting. Vermont in the 30s was also largely deforested too. Up to 90% of the trees were cut entirely. And I just want to add that as a setting, thinking about the Green Mountain State wasn't the visual Green Mountain State that we know today, right? The farms were...
It was all sheep farms.
Yep. Yeah,
90%. You think about it now, it's crazy. Like Mount Philo was just one big sheep farm. Yeah, it's amazing to think.
Twin Farms is now a luxury bed and breakfast, which makes sense if you know the area near Barnard as a state. Barnard basically is in central Vermont is what we would call it, and those who aren't familiar will probably know Woodstock and Killington, and it's roughly right between those two. It's mostly well-to-do out-of-staters who bought land for second homes, farmers who somehow are able to keep up with all the second homes increasing property values, taxes, and cost of living, Airbnbs or bed and breakfasts making a living, and retirees who snowbird in Florida with the first gale breeze comes off the spine of the Green Mountains, sending a shiver down their spine that frightens them away for a few months. So some things haven't changed as they have back then. Yeah.
If you go to Woodstock for literally an hour, you will probably see 10 to 15 Florida license plates.
Yeah, Woodstock's interesting because it's always busy, but seeing a green plate there is kind of rare. In my opinion, I think that Sinclair Lewis styled the town of Fort Beulah, Vermont, which is where the most of where he lives is based off of Barry or Brandon, based off the granite mines, specifically Barry, because it has a newspaper, the proximity to Montpelier. He never mentions Barry as well by name ever, and that's not because Barry was in an insignificant town. That was the heyday.
Yeah, that was the heyday.
Yeah,
granite, Italian immigrants.
Yeah.
Churning away, yeah.
Yeah, so he doesn't mention Italian immigrants at all, but socialist and communist and specifically anarchists. You would find at least one batch of those leftists in an Italian immigrant for sure. Burlington, Rutland, and the aforementioned Montpelier and Barnard, of all things, were also mentioned. So that's my best guess. We're going to pivot again to the characters, which we usually do in these. Obviously, we've already talked Huey Long and Father Coughlin, so we're not really going to do that other than mentioning who they referenced and influenced, but they kind of disappear once the dictator's in full swing anyway. So I want to just go over many of the main characters here because there are too many. There are just too many to go over, and these are kind of the ones that I found symbolic in their impact. Are there any that you're excited about or anything of that sort?
I love Shad. I love Shad Ledoux.
Yeah, I guess in the way that you love what happens to him.
No, I love him as I love him as just as a character. He was just a compelling, realistic, scary, vindictive character. And I thought he was a great character.
We all know a Shad Ledoux.
We all know Shad Ledoux, yep.
To begin, let's talk about the protagonist, right? The main one, Doremus Jessup. I don't know if it's Doremus or Doremus. I have no clue.
I split it by reading it and listening to an audiobook, and they said Doremus.
Is it Doremus? I thought it was Doremus because his nickname is Dormouse. Well, so, but Doremus makes sense. Sorry for butchering that for an hour and 15 minutes. I'll stick to that. Doremus is the newspaper owner and editor of the Daily Informer in Fort Beulah's daily newspaper. He also describes himself as the educated elite, which is something that the people who fall under Buzz's spell hate. He has a dog named Foolish. Not important, but I just love that he has a dog named Foolish. And he comes from a 6th-generation family, Vermont stock, I think. It was 6th generation, he said.
Yeah,
which would make sense if we're at 8 or 9 generations now, because that's a thing in Vermont. People love to say they're 8 or 9 generation. It's kind of fascinating in a weird way. With his father being a Universalist pastor. Universalists being some sort of thing that we keep going back to in this podcast. When he was younger, his father noticed he loved to read and saved up enough money to buy the whole collection of Charles Dickens' works, which outside of the newspaper was Doremus's prized possession. Only important because when the book burnings happened, that almost made me cry up. I felt for this guy.
Yeah.
That's when a fucking switch flicked inside of him, really. Doremus is the quintessential American liberal in the 1930s. He's a pacifist, believes in democracy unbendingly, and often predicts that what Buzz is going to do and his Minutemen will do next. In a lot of ways, I think Sinclair put his own philosophy and ideology in Doremus, though I also think Sinclair Lewis was more left-leaning than this standard liberal at the time based off some of the things I read about him, but he definitely knew who a liberal was. He nailed it.
Doremus just sounds like a pushover left liberal nowadays that wants to be selective about who they stand up for and what liberal issues they want to pick, so long as it doesn't ruffle too many feathers and mess with their comfortability. I love Doremus for that also, because Lewis does such a good job portraying somebody that could easily be that same character in our current times and society in Vermont or anywhere in the U.S., I guess.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that this guy is a liberal is interesting because he does develop it throughout the plot, but holy crap, it's kind of uncanny how similar it is.
Yeah, he comes around a little bit. Doremus holds it down as shit starts to hit the fan.
Mm-hmm. Well, the story, like I said, basically follows him throughout its entirety with a few exceptions. After fascism is fully implemented, the U.S. motherfucking A, Doremus goes on his own journey to figure out how he can set up a resistance, and he finally does after meeting with communists and then outright refusing their brand of resistance and then setting up or joining the New Underground, which is, he basically sets up a publication. Communism, I'm going to pivot a little bit and go back to Doremus, comes up a ton in this book, actually. I'm already at the end of 14 pages, over 8,500 words between two strips, and somehow I just brought up communism. I did this intentionally as the book is mostly Antifa, but it's also anti-communistic, and for good reason. One of the main characters that we will chat about, Carl Pascal, and his conversations with Doremus. Again, this is for a little bit of a later time, but Sinclair Lewis develops several characters who basically the whole purpose of them was just to, show the differences of political opinions and what was going on. They do the core tenets of certain political ideologies, what I wrote here. As I mentioned, Doremus, being the intellectual, nonviolent, slow-to-act liberal, he will get into trouble for that. Any questions about Doremus or anything else you want to add? Because we will talk a little bit more about him and his family, but there's just a lot to go over.
Yeah, it's interesting his, take on communism, where you read something like The Jungle by Upton Sinclair, very much more pro-communist. Yeah, so just interesting in similar time periods what, these leftist authors' takes on, different ideologies were.
Yeah, definitely. We'll talk about Upton Sinclair at the end. Not much, but I kind of figure out why he's so prominent in the early part of the book. Well, Doremus is married to Emma Jessup, who is an oblivious person and at best willfully ignorant, at worst. Emma throughout the book is just there during the fascist takeover. She's taciturn and unfazed. Basically, her life doesn't change much, and even after several of her family members died or killed outright, she just basically shrugs and goes, "What am I to do?" and continues on her life. Her portrayal as a middle-class white Christian lady who's largely unaffected personally by fascism couldn't be bothered. Well, that was excellent.
Yeah, she's great too. She's like your aunt at the Thanksgiving table that you can't bring any politics up because it's just all too sad. She just doesn't want to. They just don't want to think about it. Yeah.
Well, all too familiar. Yeah, so Emma Jessup is so unaffected by like everything that's going around that even when she's confronted with the fact that her husband Doremus has a long-standing mistress named Lorinda Pike, she waves it off and says there's no way he could possibly do that. He's too old and not that kind of guy. He could, and he is that kind of guy. To spoil the book a little bit here, after Doremus gets caught and sent to a concentration camp and then breaks out, Emma is like no longer even part of the picture. Like, she had moved on with her life entirely. Towards the very end of the book, Doremus continues to fight. Lorinda, though, on the other hand, is a woman in her mid-30s, single, and runs a tavern. She's the strong, independent woman of this generation who has a bad reputation because of her lack of a marital status, as well as running a bar. However, she also thrives as an Antifa member, and I love the part where, like, after the first time Doremus gets arrested and goes out and sees her for the first time, like, he clearly writes a horny scene that's so subtle about her, like that she absolutely loves him more than ever. Like she gets turned on about the what's it called, the underground. It's pretty funny. The subtleness about the sexuality in Sinclair Lewis's writing is also pretty interesting. Yeah. People would probably not write that anymore nowadays, at least like that. The vast majority of Doramis's family are pretty much Antifa activists, with one exception. Though, like I mentioned, not all of them live long lives. Mary Greenhill, née Jessup, is an example. After Doremus gets arrested for the first time for publishing a wildly anti-Buzz Windrip newspaper, Mary's husband, who was improbably named Dr. Fowler for whatever reason, busts into the kangaroo court and disrupts the hearing. The coy, arrogant judge, who also is improbably named Effingham Swan and is responsible for sentencing countless of people to Trianon concentration camp or to their death, well, he sentences him to his death as well. And Dr. Fowler is executed right then and there, with Doremus hearing the rifle shots. Mary holds a deep, permanent grudge and hatred against anybody who basically helped kill her husband, and takes revenge in the coolest way.
The coolest way ever. I love her. I love that part.
Yeah, I'm not going to spoil this one.
Yeah.
This was the coolest revenge I've ever heard. Yeah. And like the mental gymnastics that the corpos have to do in order for them to not believe what she did was intentional is another like purely like wonderful bit that he wrote.
It is. It's all the same tactics. It's like how the IDF has to like downplay how successful like Iranian attacks were because they can let down their shield of impenetrability or invulnerability. I mean, it's the same thing that all these great powers do. They have the mental gymnastics that they can't possibly be fallible.
Yeah, moving on to another one of Doramis's children who are on the right side of things is Cecilia, nicknamed Sissy. Cecilian is the young, about 18-year-old at the start of the book, modern woman. She's strong-willed, outspoken, and intellectual. She has a number of people who are courting her early on, and eventually her beauty does allow her to conduct espionage against one of the Minutemen, Shad Ledoux, who is probably the most despicable person in the book, in my view. She ends up dating this person named Julian Falk, who is the son of an Episcopalian minister in Fort Beulah, who also helps Doremus in publishing the underground magazine, The Episcopalian Minister, not Julian. Julian does try to infiltrate the corpos, and he's an example who gets caught, and, well, he just does not have a happy ending. It's really freaking sad what happens to him. There are a number of other characters who join the resistance that we won't be able to talk about, including Buck Titus, who is Doremus's best friend, and a Catholic priest named Father Perifix. I don't know how to pronounce this. But two people that we are going to talk about are John Polycop and the Carl Pascal. Do you have anything to say before about these guys? Because I think these guys were real caricatures, realistically.
Yeah, no, all well said.
John Polycop is a Polish immigrant who runs a mechanic shop. Polycop is not a Polish name. There's one of the things that really annoyed me about this book is that the decidedly bad names with the character. Yeah. Shad Ledoux is supposed to be an Irish immigrant.
Yeah, Irish.
Like what Ledoux is a decidedly not Irish last name. Polycop is also known as Doremus well because he organized labor strikes during for the local granite quarry. Again, granite quarry local makes me think of Barry. Of the two, John is the lesser character to Carl. Carl, on the other hand, is the staunch communist. He named the communist Carl. Yeah, that's, a bit on the nose. Yeah. The one advocating, Carl advocates for a global takeover of all governments so that workers could be reunited under one regime. Lewis uses Carl Pascal as a symbol for another type of dictatorship happening in the world, which is namely Stalinist Russia. Carl works in John's garage, and they often get into arguments about leftist ideology, which, again, doesn't sound familiar at all, with Doremus often joining in, telling them they're both wrong. At one point, before all three of them were sent to Trianon concentration camp together, Doremus basically directly and correctly calls out Carl Pascal for because Karl doesn't want a peaceful government under an American communism. He wants a dictatorship based out of Moscow, which in the 1930s is 100% true under Stalin. I mean, all you have to do is look at what was happening with the Spanish Civil War there, basically, or Eastern Europe. Yeah, Pascal, Polycarp, and Jessup all end up in Trianon, like I said, where Karl Pascal really begins to thrive in the dirty acts and the espionage needed in the depravity of this jail and this concentration camp. He helps John Polycarp out when he arrives by basically having dirt on the guards so he won't be super messed up. They all bunk together for some reason, but I guess that's just for the plot. And then the longer they bunk, the more radical they all become, even planning out the murder of one of the main victims who ends up there, which won't spoil that. For Doremus Jessup's involvement in the murder, he is shocked even by the suggestion, to which basically everybody calls out on him, saying you can't still be this liberal, nonviolent nonsense anymore. Look at what's happening around you. You're in a concentration camp, which is also emblematic of how liberals might react to like this crazy nonviolence that liberals aren't even pro. They just don't want to be the ones that are violent.
True, well said.
They continue the plot without him altogether, the plot to assassinate the person. Lewis uses Polycarp also symbolically as somebody who can get radicalized and would fall underneath a different type of dictatorship under certain circumstances. And this is just like another case study of being radicalized under communism, which never pans out. Those are the underground and the people who are, against the Buzz Windrop regime. Broadly speaking, the ones that we can talk about. There's plenty other ones. So we're going to talk about antagonists soon, but anything else you want to add?
No, I think all, ready to move on.
So Buzz, or, Berzelius, Buzz Windrop, the main fascist, you don't get some of these names anymore. Berzelius. He's based largely, like I said, off of Hitler, off of Mussolini, and Huey Long. Buzz is a populist who runs on a campaign to bring back what today amounts to be law and order in the U.S. of motherfucking A, as well as restoring prosperity during the Great Depression, promising each citizen $5,000, Huey Long's campaign, which is around $115,000 today, which, I'd like $115,000. Sounds great. Which, as a direct campaign promise, never comes to fruition. Within the novel, Sinclair Lewis opens a handful of chapters with Buzz's fictional book called 0 Hour, which, I don't know what was going on back then with Republican or conservative book titles, but that could be from anybody today.
Oh yeah, it's the way it. I loved all of those excerpts from, what was it, Zero Dark 30?
0 Hour. Zero Dark 30 is a movie about the Afghanistan war, war, yeah.
What was the book again?
0 Hour.
0 Hour, yeah. I mean, it just reads so much. It could be like, what was that, Plan 2025 or what?
Project 2025.
Project 2025, yeah.
Yeah, 0 Hour is where he champions himself as a professional common man, claiming he never wanted to get into politics but felt like he was obligated to so. He also espouses anti-Semitic beliefs and just a bunch of shit there that's pretty fucked up. We will chat more about Buzz in his 15 points. He also doesn't write 0 Hour. I think it's Lee Saracen who writes it for him, but he's the author in all intents and purposes, right? We're going to talk more about Buzz in the 15 points and everybody who kind of helps him get into a fascist dictatorship throughout him. So let's move on because there's a lot to go through. Bishop Paul Peter Prang, he's mentioned and already based off of Father Coughlin, right? I wanted to talk about him. Bishop Prang also is calling for a stronger America via a strong man on his radio show. Sounds familiar. He also develops a following called the League of Forgotten Men, which, damn, that is a great way of putting it.
Yep.
Yeah. These are the common men who feel disempowered during the Great Depression. They are grasping at simple answers for complex problems at the time. These League of Forgotten Men end up being the predecessor of the Minutemen, Buzz Windrop's private militia, who end up being the U.S. law enforcement that basically runs every facet of American life based off the black shirts in Italy or the brown shirts in Germany at the time. Bishop Prang fully endorses Buzz Windrop before the election, but basically immediately after he gets elected, he's horrified at what he's done, not realizing that, he actually meant what he was saying, like a lot of other people kind of probably had that realization in 2024, 2025, and then tries to convince Buzz and his minions to retract some of their statements and what they're going to do. He's silenced, he's disappeared, and never heard of again, becoming the first victim of Buzz's regime. Every dictator also has somebody behind the scenes. Because Buzz is somebody with charisma and could develop a following, he's basically chosen to be the figurehead of the movement. Lee Saracen, on the other hand, is the campaign manager, main speechwriter, and essentially runs the entire government once elected. He's the leader of the Minutemen and the Corpos at first, which I promise we're going to get to the Corpos soon. And basically he orders the Minutemen to come. All the Minutemen come to see Lee Saracen. They don't go to Buzz Windrip. They're Lee Saracen's men. The other person we also need to chat about, who is high up in the power, is Dewey Hake. Dewey is a psychopath and a cold-blooded murderer towards the end of the book, but beforehand, he is a congressman who nominates Windrip at the DNC. He eventually becomes the Secretary of War, and when internal power struggles get between him and between Buzz and between him and Lee, he ends up on top.
Which is often, I mean, again, well put, where just because Buzz can be kind of this charismatic figurehead that can talk to the common man, the real brains, the real scary brains are always in somebody like a Lee Saracen, who are kind of pulling the strings from, who are arguably, oftentimes even scarier. Because they actually know what's going on. They're actually smart enough to know their evils. They're not just spewing it out there.
Somebody with the last name Miller and the first name.
Yeah.
Yeah. That guy just looks so awful. Every time I look at him, I just get repulsed. It's just, what a horrible looking human being. He looks like his soul was just taken out of his body by Dementors. So we've chatted about the people in charge. Let's talk about the common Minuteman soldier. Oscar Shad Ledoux, the epitome of this character. Anything you want to add before we go on to a short paragraph on Oscar Ledoux?
No, go into Shad and I'll add some stuff after maybe.
He's originally Doramis's hired man, who is inherently lazy but doesn't ever want to do a good job at anything he does. He's described again like with Irish ancestry, but Shad Ledoux is not an Irish name. Shad, his nickname, votes for Buzz and basically joins the Minutemen immediately, which gives him an unwarranted air of superiority over everyone. He also participates in some of the worst crimes in the book, and due to his previous history of the Jessups, he's involved with the execution of Dr. Fowler and Doramis's arrests. Something that struck me about the development of this character is that throughout the book he's waiting for this $5,000, stating once that he'll get it and he'll be able to make and start a business raising chickens and will break into the middle class and get some respect. Doramus, when he says that, points out he tried raising chickens and he already died. All of them. They all died. Then somehow Shad said, well, I needed more chickens. And it's like, well, they're all just going to die again. More chickens are going to die. So this is the kind of mentality we're thinking about here. That money, like I said, never comes, and he also doesn't feel like he gains the respect he deserves within the Minutemen, as he never really gets promoted, and then he starts being shady to the Minutemen, not to everybody around him otherwise. So you don't fuck with the money, right? That's basically what happens. He gets a pretty gnarly and a very justified ending. That I won't spoil, but fuck Shad Ledoux. We all know a Shad Ledoux, right?
Yeah, and I think that, Doremus mentions that Shad came from like poor family, one of like 10 kids, probably got shit on his whole life by people in the upper crust, whatever. Does that make his actions excusable? Absolutely not. But does it provide this perfect moldable template for the rich powers that be to kind of, put this person under these circumstances into a vindictive place of power that they can really use him for their means? Absolutely. And also goes, back to the theme, everyone is a king as long as they have someone to look down on kind of thing, where he's, sees an eloquent, well-spoken black character, black minister in the book, and immediately it just enrages him that, again, he's this disenfranchised white person, but still, oh my gosh, there's this, uppity black person that he immediately has to take this power and, punch down and find some other excuse for his circumstances that's disenfranchising him and other, white poor people in the society.
Yeah, it's good that you mentioned that minister because I almost forgot about it. I mentioned it a little bit later on when we get to an overview of the 15 points. We can't do every one of those, right? But like, again, we're talking about America and how fascism can work in America, and like especially at the time of the 30s with Jim Crow as being the law of the land in the South specifically. Well, I mean, I think Sinclair Lewis did an excellent job, including how African Americans and Black Americans would like be treated underneath this regime as well as second-class citizens.
And you have Trump referring to things as black jobs, and then again in the 15 points you have a whole section about you know, encouraging essentially the same thing, encouraging black people to take quote-unquote black jobs and leaving the more favorable ones to the whites. I mean, it's the same stuff happening now, just different wolf and same sheep's clothing.
Yeah, just 90 years later, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. We're going to talk about another Jessup. This one is Philip Jessup. He spells it with a PH, so no relation. He's a lawyer who gets promoted to a district attorney and is basically a stooge for the corpo government. He confronts his father once by saying that he should just join because he's going to get a better life that way, right? Things are not so bad for people like us if you join the corpos. You might even like play by the rules and you find you'll do well for yourself. He's just like a coward, and his father calls him a coward himself and basically disowns him. But Philip Jessup is that guy who plays along and gets promoted. The last person I want to talk about isn't fiction. Rather, he's just a famous contemporary writer at the time. And though he plays a pretty minor role in the novel, his inclusion proves to me that Sinclair Lewis can be a pretty petty bitch at times, and it's still funny. This guy, like Upton Sinclair, obviously wrote The Jungle and the book Oil, which There Will Be Blood, the movie, is very loosely based on. Very loosely. He's a communist activist in real life and became famous for depicting poverty and espousing corruption and awful health standards in the early 20th century. It's really difficult to find books by him because of, what happened with the Red Scare. You can still find The Jungle easily. I learned that he ran an anti-poverty platform camp when he ran for governor of California in 1934, and Sinclair Lewis directly takes his real life campaign promises and intertwines them with Buzz Windrip's fictionalized one. He does this because Sinclair Lewis once lived in the failed Helicon house owned by Upton Sinclair, which is mentioned a couple of times, and they have a pretty direct relationship. They knew each other, and I don't know what happened, but when I do an Upton Sinclair or a Sinclair Lewis episode, I'm going to find out. It's going to be interesting. So this is, I think, a reason why he was added was just to just to be fuck you, Upton Sinclair. I don't like you anymore. Again, that's it's such a petty move. All right, well, let's talk corporism. This I found fascinating because he nailed this. This is something that really stuck out to me as the tenet of fascist people. People just tend to forget that corporations are always on the side of fascism, or at least some of them are, and they now have an excuse to have that supreme authority that they want to treat their workers like total shit. It's a pretty wild thing that Sinclair Lewis caught on to this in 1934 and 1935, because that really wasn't the knowledge at the time. And if you don't believe me, here's a short list of German companies that I found and could pronounce easily who were involved in the Holocaust. Allianz, AEG, Aldercars, Bayer, BMW, Continental, Deutsche Bank, Dresden Bank, Hugo Boss, IG Farben, Mercedes-Benz, Merck Group, Opel, Porsche, Puch, Reichsbach, Siemens, Volkswagen Group, and Zeiss Icon. Here are the ones, if you aren't convinced, that were Americans, including the Associated Press. It's unbelievable how much the AP absolutely loved fascism.
These American companies were also involved in the Holocaust?
In the Holocaust.
Okay, yep.
Coca-Cola, Chase National, Ford, IBM, who helped categorize all Jews into companies in Europe, Kafka, hint, Palantir. They were the ones that got the systems in place through note cards of who was Jewish and who was not, IBM. And last but not least, Kodak. We wouldn't have Fanta as a soda if it wasn't for Coca-Cola's involvement.
Yep.
It's depressing. So when you see a person or persons who, are up on stage after an election, who run, I don't know, major tech companies, or I don't know, used to own a book selling company and now is the largest company in the world, or again, who owns social media companies or is the CEO of a massive, let's say, computer company, and sell a lot of phones on stage at President Trump's inauguration, that really shouldn't have surprised people.
It is infuriating.
Mm-hmm. It's infuriating, not surprising. It Can't Happen Here shows, again, how Lewis's perspective and instinct predicted this so much earlier on. In context, after the fascists destroyed the possibilities of other parties, basically. He writes that, quote, there was to be only one, the American corporate state and the patriotic party. Added the president with something of his former good humor. There are two parties, the corporate and those who don't belong to any party at all. And so, to use a common phrase, you are just out of luck. The idea of corporate or corporative state, Secretary Lee Saracen had more or less taken from Italy, unquote. We didn't talk about the corporate state in Italy because it's not as successful as the Nazi German one. But again, fiat, hint, hint, cough, cough. And yes, this is how we could tie this idea back to Mussolini's Italy, even though, there wasn't a march on Rome per se. They are much, much more on board than you would like to believe politically, these massive corporations. So, anything you want to add about corporism? Because it's dark, but damn.
Yeah, I think that, simply put, it is just infuriating that, I don't know, to call out or to address how these massive multi-billion dollar corporations buy our politicians, buy our elections, and just control us as a people. Any call out of that just gets teased or vilified as socialism or as anti-American or as anti-capitalism, and it just it's very frustrating that the societal lens, that it's not a commonplace topic or something that people like to think about or like to address, because we are such a materialistic society that is so hung up on our things and our products and the latest tech and the latest editions of things. So, it would be hypocritical for us to start calling those things out. But, then you look into the evils that are really lurking behind. So it's frustrating. And, and now you see people like Mamdani hopefully gonna run and win for New York City mayor.
Yeah, I mean, he's a shoo-in now, right?
Yeah, and it's just knows? Which of these corporations is gonna?
Well, hopefully not. Probably not. I mean, the horrifying thing is that immediately right-wing figures who are completely psychopathic, just out of touch of reality, is trying to either exile him or remove his status as a national citizen. It's they're calling for that the day afterwards.
It's crazy, yeah, because he threatens these corporations. Anything that can allow the mass of the people to think differently or to look more introspectively or to look more behind the veil, they are gonna just. I hope he can really stick it out. My thoughts are with him because he's already been getting some nasty rhetoric and slander, and it's just gonna come for until November.
Yeah, and past that too. Yeah, he is what he's already done and achieved is incredible, but they know that there's a short time before, if they don't snub him out soon, there's going to be a lot more people who are going to love him, and that's frightening to the establishment.
Yep.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned him because it's admirable what he's doing, and I wish him the best. Because why not? I mean, he is not a stooge, and he is not, I don't know, a corporate he hasn't been sent to jail or pardoned or anything like that. He hasn't had any scandals too. So even if you're not politically savvy and don't believe in him, why would you vote for Cuomo or Eric Adams? Why would you? They're shitty. They're just shitty
provenly corrupt people who clearly do not have your interests at heart.
Nope. moving on to the book, because we're gonna need to discuss like the 15 points. We're not gonna go through every one. We're only gonna do for a handful, though. If you really want to read it, it's the entirety of chapter 8. It's roughly 50 to 60 pages in, depending on your version. Going over of these would be its own episode, if not more. And since we're not really experts on the subject of fascism, let's say, all we did was read a few articles in this book. I won't exhaust listeners about how this directly correlates with the tenets of fascism and how it basically is established, which, at the point wasn't really well known throughout the 1930s, at least not how it's fully studied today, because, well, there was no history of it realistically. So let's go over the 15 points of victory for the forgotten men, starting with number 1. Quote, all finance in the country, including banking, insurance, stocks, and bonds and mortgages, shall be under absolute control of a federal bank. Further on, it says, the nationalization and government ownership for the profit of the whole people of all mines, oil fields, water power, public utilities, transportation, and communications will be underneath, the federal bank, basically. This private ownership of finance being eliminated, which it doesn't sound like a bad thing if you're a real leftist. It is kind of a bad thing when you have just banks owned by the government. It doesn't really work. Public ownership of utility companies, however, kind of rad.
Yeah.
So transportation as well, it's pretty tantalizing. So it's interesting to think that this is the theory behind it. However, usually with fascism, just because they claim that they made the trains run on time doesn't mean it's true. We're skipping to point number 4. Quote, believing that only under God Almighty, to whom we render all homage, do Americans hold our vast power, we shall guarantee to all persons absolute freedom of religious worship, provided, however, that no atheist, agnostic, believer in black magic, or any Jew who shall refuse to swear allegiance to the New Testament, nor any, which means that he's not Jewish, nor any person of any faith who refuses to take the pledge to the flag shall be permitted to hold any public office or to practice as a teacher, professor, lawyer, judge, or a physician, except in the category of obstetrics. This is pretty cut and dry Christo-fascism over here. At the time, I don't think America had a huge Muslim population. It doesn't today, but there wasn't a thing back then at all. So I think that was covered underneath any other person of any faith. However, right off the bat, he's talking about America and how he would run a fascist state. He nails Christo-fascism here, right? And I mean, even Trump has his rhetoric about under God and all that shit. He's clearly not a religious man. Anything on that one?
Yeah, Trump is not, but he sees the value of leaning into it.
We won't quote number 5, but it's worth mentioning because that's where the accumulated fortune and inheritance and annual incomes campaigns that are similar to Huey Long's is outlined. Number 8 is, quote, Congress shall have the sole right to issue money, and immediately upon our inauguration it shall at least double to present to the present supply of money. So they're going to double the supply of money in order to facilitate the fluidity of credit. All right, I think they started to go off the gold standard under FDR, but even if they're doubling the money supply, simple economics means that inflation is going to skyrocket. This is really stupid. It just shows that, again, they don't do it in the book, but they just don't understand how economy works. Number 10 is a real spicy one, and I'm just going to let people know I changed one word to Black American, not because it's a racial slur, but it's an antiquated word that once categorized a group of people in the country, and it could be misconstrued as one, so just avoiding controversy. In this episode, we're avoiding controversy, right? Quote, all Black Americans shall be prohibited from voting, holding office, practicing law, medicine, or teaching in any class about the grade of grammar school, and they shall be taxed 100% of all sums in the excess of $10,000 per family, which they may earn or in any other manner receive, unquote. And then later on, I didn't add it to the quote, so I'm glad that you mentioned what they were actually allowed to do, because this is basically enshrining Jim Crow into federal law, right? Don't get me wrong, corpos also punish Jewish people as well as other people who aren't Christian, they don't like. However, fascism needs an internal enemy, the marginalized intentionally, And if we're going to do a uniquely American thing in the 1930s, it's the African American black population of the time. Like, simply put, it still could be to this day. However, now it really seems that the GOP and like their followers have pivoted to illegal immigrants or illegal aliens, as you could see in ICE, right? That's like the big scare. But, first they came for the communists, and I did not speak out, Right.
Yeah, it's the same playbook, like you said. They constantly need an internal enemy, and what was the Secretary of War in this book? The Buck something, or
Dewey Haig.
Dewey Haig.
Eventually,
how he also very rightly says that we also need to be an endless war. So what he wants to like take over Mexico or start war on Mexico.
Yes.
It's like we just export, and it's true. We export weapons, we export war and dictatorship and chaos into other countries. So we constantly, and we can see it literally right now, literally today, we just constantly need to embroil ourselves in war so that we don't have to reflect on ourselves. We can still generate income and revenue through endless wars. So yeah, again, just like very, very apt that they're addressing, like you're saying with ICE now, internal enemies, external enemies, endless, constant war, constant violence, constant flux, so we don't have time to look at how terrible we are. And yeah, I mean, it's like the thing about the black jobs, African American jobs, not having a right to vote and stuff. It's like kind of when you see it on paper, it almost seems laughable how just put out there like that. But then you think about redlining and segregation in housing and school districts and neighborhoods and stuff that still goes on today that's reflected in our cities and towns segregated. And so it's just like once you like just do your own research and a little digging, just because this book is putting it out in very bright, big, clear terms, it's like it is happening, and it has happened for decades and generations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, 100%.
Gerrymandering, that was the word.
Yep. Well, redlining. Same.
Redlining too, yeah.
Number 12, basically, I think I heard somebody, like a House Republican, say this in 2025. Quote, all women now employed shall, as rapidly as possible, except in such peculiar feminine spheres of activity as nursing and beauty shops, be assisted to return to their incomparably sacred duties as homemakers and as mothers of strong, honorable future citizens of the Commonwealth, unquote. Yeah. That's pretty cut and dry, too. Number 15 is the last one, obviously, and it's long, but this is something that I think was, again, it could be found directly in Project 2025. Not as concisely, because I think Sinclair Lewis is a better writer than anybody who wrote Project 2025, but in these 15 points, Buzz Windrip says that all points can be modified or tweaked except for this one, and it's clear why. Quote, Congress shall immediately upon inauguration initiate amendments to the Constitution providing A, that the President shall have the authority to institute and execute all necessary measures for the conduce of the government during this critical epoch. B, that Congress shall only serve in an advisory capacity, calling to the attention of the President and his aides and the Cabinet any needed legislation, but not acting upon, and C, that the Supreme Court shall immediately have removed from its jurisdiction the power to negate by ruling them to be unconstitutional or by any judicial action, any or all acts of the President, his duly appointed aides, or Congress, unquote. This gives the executive branch absolute control with no checks and balances, which we are witnessing currently. Yeah, and it's the only one that they want, because as soon as you have it, who cares about the other ones, right?
Yep.
Like, I've read the book already. I reread this book for this podcast, and that one made me go, holy shit. Like, that one, like, all of them were nefarious and gnarly, but that one I had to put the book down and go,
yeah,
fuck. God damn it. Anything else on the 15 points before, I'm going to go over the type of people who voted for Trump, except for you voted for Buzz.
Freudian slip.
Continue on. Yeah, let's do this because it's pertinent. Sinclair Lewis, again, put his finger on the pulse when he wrote, quote, most of the mortgage farmers, most of the white-collar workers who have been unemployed these 3 years and 4 or 5. Most of the people on relief rolls who wanted more relief. Most of the suburbanites who could not meet the installment payments on the electric washing machine. Such large sections of the American Legion who believed Buzz would secure it for them, perhaps increased that bonus march. And popular preachers such as Bishop Prang or Follett Coughlin in supporting a slightly less odd campaign, the remnants of the Ku Klux Klan, Backstreet and over the garage lawyers that wrangled up governmental jobs. These are the supporters who looked at Buzz to play the divine raven and feed them handsomely to be the next president. Any of this sound familiar?
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, we're going to wrap up now a little bit about some of the things that were just kind of odd. Like, I wanted to mention that, like, there's a total war against higher education. I mean, there's a complete restructuring here. Anything to add there?
Yeah, just everything that's happening now, where they literally explicitly mentioned Columbia, where all the professors were fired who voted for whoever Buzz was running, Tunbridge or something, but just crazy. It's literally the same institutions named.
Yep. Buzz also dismantles the free press, basically entirely instituting his own people. And this may be very similar to kicking out AP reporters during presidential press conferences and bringing in complete and total nutjob conspiracy theorists who have no grip on reality whatsoever and are just YouTube heads.
Defunding PBS and NPR and
NPR will probably be okay. PBS, I don't know. Both of them will probably be okay. Some people will lose their jobs though, but most of their money comes from outside sources. Yeah. Finally, towards the end of the book, when the corporals realize that their plans aren't working and people start to question them, they finally start focusing on the external war, as you mentioned. They do ultimately choose to go to the war with Mexico, which, again, the Trump administration has openly stated that they are willing to invade our neighbors to the south to fight cartels multiple times, as a joke sometimes, but they want any pretense. But the corpos also joked about invading places like Canada, joked about Ethiopia, which is a jab on Mussolini's Italy, actually.
Oh, yeah.
And
Get your ass kicked, Mussolini.
Yeah, seriously. And finally, they joke about invading Greenland.
Wow, yeah. I forgot about that one, too.
Oh, too prescient. We talked about the similarities, obviously, about the rise of Trump and his second administration. However, there are clear differences, and I wanted to mention that, basically, because the dismantling of American institutions is far more complex and difficult due to the tangled web throughout basically the public and private sector, that both of them heavily rely on one another. I'm sure everybody knows someone who got doged, and I hate that I had to use that word, and literally everybody who's pissed off about the public sale of public land soon to the highest bidding billionaire, because that's just straight up robbing your land. They're robbing you of your land that way. It's everyone's land, but it's yours if you want to think about it that way. We already have roaming ICE agents that don't have to, hold on to the Constitution. They want to basically have a takeover of the country, and they're often incompetent in the face of real pushback. They are cowards. Anybody who wears masks when they try to tackle somebody who is weaker than them and not armed is a coward, realistically. But in my view, a lot of these is just wannabe dictator shit. There is not a real strong underground, but retaliation and resistance will grow. And America is a unique group of individualistic people, slightly psychotic and heavily armed. Now, this isn't saying that we should go and fight with arms. What this is saying is purely at a statistic. America is the most armed populace in the history of civilization ever, period. That's fucking nuts to think. So I guarantee there's going to be some executive order soon about gun restrictions, and that we're going to piss some people off. It's part of Project 2025. Before ending this podcast, I have a quote, but do you have anything you want to add to that?
No, I think we've gone over a lot of what I had here. I think that one other, not really a quote, I just noted it here, when Doremus is just ripping into his son, which I love, that he just turned on his son for just, being a corpo puppet. But he basically says something along the lines of, a country that tolerates evil means for a generation will be so poisoned that it will never have any good end. So just basically that, these people in the book and right now what we're seeing, they justify a lack of empathy, a lack of violence, or a forefront of violence as a means to an end. But again, the evils of violence and oppression never justify any ends. And I think the other quote I had was, this country has gone so flabby that they can just go and grab the power because we'll do nothing about it. And that's, again, just kind of what we're seeing.
I had a quote, but those are better. We're going to end on those two. So food for thought, guys. There really aren't a lot of sources. It's just opinions that we had, and It Can't Happen Here by Sinclair Lewis, the Signet Classics edition on my end, and then some synopsis and like a work from Lit Charts just to go over and make sure what I read was actually correct. My Patreon is Lost in the Library Podcast. If any questions, please send the Lost in the Library Podcast at gmail.com. Follow us on Instagram, Lost in the Library, and the Substack is at Fil Deptula. Well, it was a pleasure. I got to get my baby out of my wife's hands. It's my turn to have her.
Yeah.
Anything you want to add?
No, thank you. This was great, and it was so nice getting to meet the new member of the family. And yeah, love you and what you're doing. I'm happy for you.
Thanks so much. Love you, guy, and let's anytime. Let's pick another book for 2 or 3, 4 or 5 months from now.
Yeah.
All right. Cheers.